And in order to keep the thrills up, the genre sort of forces the writer to make them more and more grotesque. You know, more and more disgusting crimes, more and more pathology, you know, in their personal lives that got them that way. And so often, to bring that to the reader, they end up being narrated in part by the killer and in part by, you know, it's kind of one of those. And I just find myself totally uninterested in this serial killer. Now, other people apparently are completely fascinated with it, but it never has worked for me. And you don't do that in your books.
I do hate it when the author will sort of do it just for shock value. And I've been noticing that in a few authors that I read, and I absolutely do not like that at all. In fact, I kind of promised myself that I wouldn't do that. I kind of love the Alfred Hitchcock approach, where you sort of take the reader up to the edge, and then you just kind of leave them there. So I never ever take a reader through the actual murder. They always see the aftermath. And the reason that I do that is because I figure that the reader has a much more twisted imagination of what's happening than anything I can put into words.
Well, it's probably scarier, but I mean, that's the same approach to writing sex scenes in books. You know, which is more titillating? Is that, you know, taking somebody to the bedroom door or to the edge of the bed and then leaving them and you get to fill in? Or, you know, describing the whole thing. And I mean, like the Regency genre, if you're in romance, I've always been addicted to Jane Austen, Georgette Hare, and then, you know, various exponents of that. And the modern ones, it's just kind of an excuse for, you know, a lot of sex with better manners. And I'm just, I don't care, you know. I mean, that wasn't why I read them. I liked the drawing room comedy. I liked, you know, the manners of the time and all. And the sex just, as far as I'm concerned, drags everything down. And I feel the same way about scenes of graphic violence and all. I'm not sure at this stage, after 20 years doing this, if I'm disgusted so much as I am so bored. I just, like, you know, been there, done that, flipped through this.
Well, that's one thing that's so neat about the reading experience, is that every reader sort of brings his or her own experiences to that sitting. And I love that about reading, so that, you know, your imagination of what romance really is, or what a murder really is, you bring that experience to the reading. You know, people talk about taking books to film too. That's one reason why I don't know that I will ever sell Maggie Odell until I'm finished with her, because I don't want the reader to have a certain actress in his or her head. I want each reader to come with their own perception of what that protagonist is like.
That's even a danger with audiobooks.
That's true. That's true.
Especially
and I have a hard time,
if you happen to hear a voice.
I have a very hard time listening to my own audio, because I do hear different voices in my head, and those aren't them.
Yeah, I've had a lot of writers say, I mean, it's a
But I
question
love other
that comes
ones.
up.
I love listening to other audiobooks.
Well, you would, but in your case,
Yes.
it can pose a real danger to you. And another question we often get at the Poison Pen from fans is, you know, if your books were filmed, who would you cast? And I see most writers just go totally adrift, because the truth is there isn't anybody.
There really isn't.
You know, because it's their character, and they really don't want to see Alec Baldwin or, you know, Julia Roberts or something, because then, unfortunately, in that sort of alchemical way of film, that character becomes the act. I mean, who can really think of Sam Spade unless you see Humphrey Bogart? It's almost impossible.
That's very true.
And so I think for a writer, it's probably really dangerous and unnerving.
I think so. I think it could either be the kiss of death, or very, very few times be, you know, successful. But I stay away from that question as much as possible.
I'm sure you do. I've said this before, but I can't remember if it was on this program or rather during one of our book events. But I remember in 1990 at a mystery conference in London. It was at a time when the P.D. James's Adam Dalgliesh series was being, you know, and they have in fact done all of them except the most recent one. And we've changed from Roy Marsden to a new fella for the last one or two. But this was when Roy Marsden was playing Dalgliesh, and P.D. James came into the room, and Roy Marsden was there, and people flocked up to them, and 100% of them talked to him about the character. And I still remember watching her standing there tapping her foot, And she was way too polite, you know, to kill anyone. But at the same time, you could see that she was really unhappy that people turned to him for questions, interpretations of the character, you know, on
like
and on.
He had created
yeah,
it.
exactly. And I think that really is, you know, that's part of what the movies are all about, isn't it? Or television.
It is, and I would like to believe that they're two separate experiences.
You mean the reading and the viewing?
Yes.
Well, they are. And if you read Marshall McLuhan and you really understand his book, The Medium as the Message, there are a whole lot of reasons why it's a different experience, one of which is simply that the act of reading is solitary and the act of viewing is often communal.
Well, and that's one thing with writing thrillers, though, too, is that, you know, if you can key into what the reader has that he or she fears, then all you have to do is sort of trigger that and bring them, again, like I said, the Alfred Hitchcock approach. You take them to the edge and you sort of leave them there with their own fears that they've already brought to the reading experience. You can't do that really with a visual because the visual demands too much, I think. You can with a reading experience.
I think that's very true. You don't get that or you don't let the reader's imagination take over and keep working. I mean, there are some books, for example, Gone with the Wind. Do you really want to know what happens when she goes back to Tara? I mean, I eschew all sequels. There was a terrible sequel to Rebecca. I can't remember what it was called. I think it was the one called Mrs. De Winter. But, I mean, the truth is, once the house burned down, the house was the main character in the book. And, you know, who really wants to know what happened to Maxim and Mrs. De Winter once it's over?
I think that's, like you said earlier, that you just get sort of bored when an author kind of gives you too many details of what's going on now and then. It takes away too much from the imagination. And the imagination and bringing your own imagination is part of the reading experience.
Well, I also think the opportunity to write your own ending is one that readers probably enjoy. And you, in a way, kind of did that with A Perfect Evil. You know, you didn't totally finish up that story, which drove you last year to write A Necessary Evil, didn't it?
Well, that was sort of a mistake on my part, and I didn't have an ending, and readers sort of demanded an ending. And it was kind of funny because it was like everywhere that I went, no matter where I was, I remember being in Italy and in Germany and in England, and everyone asking, now, okay, A Perfect Evil, when are you going to finish that? When are you going to, like, answer those unanswered questions? And for a long time I told people, you know, sometimes that's the way it is. You know, life isn't all tied up, and nobody bought it. So it took me 5 years. It took me 5 years to write the sequel because I didn't have an ending that was any different.
That's probably a clever marketing ploy if only you'd known. I mean, I don't
only,
think you did it for that reason.
Didn't. I obviously didn't.
I've talked to you about it, but it would have been, had you intentionally done it, really a pretty brilliant idea.
You know what's really frustrating, though, is that people will read A Necessary Evil, and I think that I pretty much tied things up quite nicely, and people will say, okay, now what happened? When's the sequel of that one coming out?
You're kidding.
No.
No, I thought you wrapped it up.
I thought so, too.
I mean, I think of them as a pair, and that's one reason I brought this up for readers watching this program and are not familiar with your work, is that they should read A Perfect Evil first, and then read A Necessary Evil, because it's kind of two halves of a whole. But no, I thought you were done.
I think it's definitely what you said about readers sort of wanting to create their own endings. I think some readers have read A Necessary Evil and have kind of figured out in their own way that there's still room for a sequel to the
Yeah, but now we're
sequel.
getting into Die Hard 3 or something. I mean, please. You know.
I think that it's kind of over.
Yeah,
Yes.
I can't recommend that well,
can't
you're
either.
the author, but
I can't
nevertheless. But, all right, but there are, 5 Maggie Odells, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so the 3 in-betweeners, what are those about? I mean, you've got A Perfect Evil, and then you moved on and wrote 3 more.
Well, Split Second is actually somewhat of a sequel to A Perfect Evil, because there's a killer that Maggie has sort of dealt with, Albert Stuckey, and you know that she's dealt with him in her past, and you read about him in A Perfect Evil. And so Split Second sort of brings him back and has her deal with him again. The Soul Catcher is basically about, for me, it was about her relationship with her mother and throwing her
that
mother
alcoholic
into
mother that you thoughtfully
that I needed
us.
to do something with. Yes, there needed to be something that happened between their, for their relationship. And then at the stroke of madness, Maggie was supposed to be on vacation, and I take her up to Connecticut, and they find bodies in barrels,